Hello and welcome to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, the programme that brings you the stories of believers living in Israel and the West Bank, both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians. Recently, I travelled to Haifa to meet Rita Tsukahira. Along with her husband Peter, they're leaders of a congregation in the north of Israel. 7 years ago, Rita unexpectedly found herself having to care for refugees entering Israel illegally. This was not something she was anticipating, so I asked her, what happened?
I would say that God is full of surprises, and we had sensed in the acquisition of some very old buildings that these would be used for helping women. The only word I got really was to be a refuge, from Psalm 46, to lead them to the refuge that God provides. That's a very loose paraphrase. And we took in all kinds of women the first 2-3 years, women who had been badly abused, women who had problems with alcohol, even drug addicts, but that wasn't the focus of our work. We always felt we were taking in women who were desperate at that moment, and then we could help them through crisis. Long term, we were just waiting to see, without even, I think, realizing we were waiting. And the phone call did come almost 7 years ago to the day that there was a woman waiting at the border. Actually, she was being held by the Israeli army. And somehow the word got out that we did take in women. And probably because we were not a government agency, we were not anyone known, they heard about us from an NGO that said, yeah, try them, because nobody would take this woman. She would have been put into prison. So the immigration police called and said, we're going to take her. Her daughter was 6 at the time. We'll take her daughter and put her in an institution, and we'll put the woman in prison where they were holding the men who had come across the border from Egypt. At this time in 2006, the civil war in Sudan was, in a sense, finishing up. There was a peace agreement that was to be fulfilled in the coming years, but things were still very bad in Sudan, and the Darfur genocide was really raging. So what you had in Cairo was hundreds of thousands of refugees who were waiting to go somewhere else, and nothing was happening, and they were feeling the Egyptians didn't want them. There had been a terrible demonstration where actually Sudanese children had been killed. And so this was a spillover, and we were seeing the very, very, very first coming across the border, one family at a time, crossing in the darkness of night, seeking a place, and they saw Israel as that place of shelter.
Now, Rita, when you first opened your Centre for Women, did you ever imagine that you would be taking in refugees?
Never, ever, never. You know, I think for years I also didn't know exactly which direction I was going to go in my own life. I had had a very different background before we moved to Israel in academia, and really wondered if God just didn't have a plan for me anymore. I wonder, which of course is ridiculous. But when we were able to purchase these old guest houses, and that's a miraculous story in itself, the word I got really again was to take in women in need, never thinking that African refugees would show up. But you know, throughout the Tanakh or the Old Testament, the people of Israel are told to care for the stranger. It's in the Torah, it's in Leviticus. It's a very clear call to love the stranger. Well, the Lord brought the stranger right to our doorstep. And it was a great surprise that that stranger was an African, specifically Sudanese refugee.
Presumably these people were arriving traumatized, and they also had children with them.
That's correct. They had no idea what to expect. And actually, we were considered an alternative to detention, but there was no subculture of Sudanese. There was no place for them to go. They stayed in our shelter. From that one first woman we took in 2 Muslim women. Within 2 weeks, who were completely traumatized. In fact, I tell the story, and probably have said it before, that the second Muslim woman that we took in was a young woman who had just actually had her baby as she crossed the border. There was a death threat against her, actually a fatwa. She had opposed the government in Khartoum, so she and her husband fled. And she was so scared and so frightened. And here she is in a Jewish, Messianic Jewish place. And she actually would sleep in bed with the Christian woman, the first woman who came, just for the protection, to feel, because the other one was a bit older, to feel that maternal sense. It was such a picture of what only God can do. And these lovely two Muslim women were both political asylum seekers. And we tried to give them the understanding that there is a Father in heaven who loves them. And they began to heal. We began to see smiles. We began to see little Mohammed running around our services and dancing. And that was the very beginning.
So you integrated them from the start into the congregation?
That's correct. You know, we had no blueprint. We had no plan. We know that God desires to heal. Of course we prayed. Of course we had people who would listen and speak. But we found that it was really our own people sharing the love of Yeshua, of Jesus with them, that was the greatest healer. When people volunteered to bring in professionals from the refugee world, I have to say, it didn't work. And we had to make up for some of the damage because it was just a different approach. And the approach that the Lord had shown us was really one to immerse them, not to pressure them to become what we are, but to immerse them in the understanding that God brought them to us and He loves them despite the horrors. And they had all experienced horrors that they had been through.
And these people just kept coming. You were swamped with people, weren't you?
That's correct. And in the middle, we had a war, the war in Lebanon in 2006, which is another trauma on top of their trauma. One of the Sudanese women who had come a little later, she began to beat her child mercilessly after one of the alarms had gone off. We were all in the shelter. The fear, she just took it out on her son to be again in a war. It was a real time of learning for us, to learn how to deal with that, to separate her from her child, to comfort her, to help her. And they kept coming with bigger families.
Rita, can you just tell us one or two of the stories, the typical stories? Because some of them were very young girls, weren't they?
Well, actually, the Muslim woman I spoke to you about was very young and just barely 20. And she had been tortured in prison. She'd been beaten for opposing the government. And of course, she would probably never go back to see her family again, because Israel and Sudan, and now there's two different nations, but back then there's of course only one, are, I would say, at war in terms of what our relationship is, our technical relationship, and she has no hope of going back. And this girl, we walked through such depression. She's actually still in the country, in the south of the country with her children, and it was a very hard time to know how to bring His healing into that. Now, if we fast forward, and I think there's a lot in between, but I'll fast forward to now because the population's very different now. Now we take in women who have been what is considered human trafficking victims. They have come through the desert. Some have even been kidnapped from the border of Eritrea and Sudan. They sit there waiting to be picked up to go work somewhere. And the Bedouins who are smuggling and into not very legal pursuits pick them up, take them to what's now been called the torture camps. In fact, CNN has two very good documentaries on these camps. They take them there, they rape the women, they do terrible things and extort tremendous amounts of money. One woman came to us who had been in the camps, had become pregnant, and she was somehow got to the border of Israel, and she had been put into prison and had tried desperately to get an abortion. And because she was already far gone, they wouldn't allow it. She was, I think, at that point, 6 months. Then they released her to go to, there's one shelter for trafficked women in the country run by the government, and there was no room there, and that's because God wanted her with us. She came to us in deep, deep, deep depression, angry, hurt, still wanting an abortion. And this was 8 months. And somebody I knew who's not a believer in the scriptures tried to set up an appointment for another committee. In Israel, you have to go through committees. And the concern was for her own, she would commit suicide. She was just so depressed psychologically. And finally we convinced her that she would have the baby, and she said, I will not give this baby away, but I don't want to see this baby alive. So the fear was she would kill her baby after she would have it. She had the baby. One of our staff was with her. I left for 15 minutes and missed the birth. And because it was one of the most miraculous things I've ever witnessed, I walked in and she was holding the baby and nursing. Now, she was on watch for the entire time she was in the hospital, but she bonded. Now that beautiful baby is 8 months old, and she loves her baby. She wants desperately to work because she has to pay back the money for the money that was extorted for her to be released. But the beauty of seeing that little girl, and she asked us to name her. We named her Lilach, which is like the lilac.
Rita Tsukahira, a Jewish believer living in the north of Israel, and we'll hear more from Rita on next week's programme. You're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, and the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. So if you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, PO Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA, that's in the UK. Do join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.